The title of our webinar today is Black Lives Matter and the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as you all know, this is a seminar that we're doing with Dr. Vincent Tondi. Let's see. And we have several co-sponsors of our seminar. One of them is Prevent Nuclear War Maryland, Maryland Peace Action, Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Baltimore Nonviolence Center, the Maryland Poor People's Campaign, and Massachusetts Peace Action. And we're grateful to all of our co-sponsors for helping us to get the word out about this. I want to briefly go over the agenda. First, we're having an introduction, which I'm doing now, and then Dr. Intondi will speak, and then we'll have a brief presentation from Max Lobachevsky, who is a longtime peace activist in Maryland. Then we'll have Q&A, and the way that we'll do that is I'll ask you to type your questions into chat, and then I'll read them to Dr. Intondi or to Max, and then we'll have a few closing comments. I want to give special thanks to Max, both for his long and faithful advocacy in opposition to nuclear weapons and to other peace issues. A special thank you to Russ Passon, who is helping us with the technology issues and with Facebook. And a special thank you to Dr. Gwen Du Bois, who is a leader in Maryland and in the country really on nuclear weapons. And now it's my very, very great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Vincent Intondi. He's a professor of history at Montgomery College, director and founder of the Institute for Race, Justice, and Civic Engagement at Montgomery College. He's the author of a very interesting book, which I highly recommend. It's called African Americans Against the Bomb, Nuclear Weapons, Colonialism, and the Black Freedom Movement. And he has a number of other terrific experiences. One of them, he was the director of research at American University's Nuclear Studies Institute. I met Dr. Intondi about a year and a half ago when he did a plenary speech at a conference that we organized in Towson. That was the first time that I had heard him speak, and I was blown away, as everybody was who heard him. It was the best plenary speech I think I have ever heard in my life, and I've heard a lot. So we were thrilled that he did this wonderful job for us, and was so great. His scholarship is terrific. He's a brilliant speaker, as I've just said, and he's kind and is a wonderful teacher. And I know that because my grandson took a couple of classes from him this past year. So it's a terrific honor to present Dr. Vincent Intondi, who will now, I'll turn it over to you, Vinny, and you can blow everyone away again.
Well, thank you all for being here tonight. I know if you're like me and care so deeply about this issue, there's been so much content, so much wonderful content, speakers, writing, arts, and things to look at these last couple days. And of course, thanks to all of the organizations that sponsor this, and of course, Gene and Max for really spearheading this whole thing. I will preface that I have 4 dogs, so I apologize if you hear any of them. I want to thank my wife because she's on dog duty right now upstairs, so hopefully you won't hear any of them through this. And it's a little weird for me being here, obviously with COVID, but also usually for years I would take students around the country to Hiroshima and Nagasaki at this time, and I've never really missed one of these bigger year anniversaries. And you know, Nagasaki is often forgotten, and a lot of my students actually liked Nagasaki better when they would visit. It was more intimate. They liked the ceremony better, the museum even better. And I remember the first time I ever went to Nagasaki, I was a student back in 2005, and we came out of the museum, and we were all sobbing, crying, and holding one another. And there was this Japanese girl, she couldn't have been more than 10 years old, and she had a guitar with her, and she was sitting on a bench, and she saw us and immediately broke out and started singing a Michelle Branch song. And she said to us that was the only American song she knew. And she did it to thank us for being there and for caring about this issue and to try and make sure it never happened again. And then to this day, if I ever hear that Michelle Branch song, I can see her face. It's kind of tattooed in my mind. So I'm glad that actually we are together on August 9th and not forgetting about Nagasaki as well. So to get started, my research focuses on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons. And I am somebody who, from my research, believes that you can't talk about nuclear weapons without talking about racism, that these things are inextricably linked. And to really get into that, we need to take actually a step back and look at briefly the history of racism in this country, if we're going to connect Black Lives Matter to the nuclear disarmament movement. And so when you do that, the question ultimately becomes, what came first in this country? Did racism cause slavery, or because we enslaved people from Africa, did that then cause us to be racist? And when you start peeling that onion back and you start looking at that question, you'll see that racism, institutional racism, systemic racism in this country is connected to capitalism and our economic system. The reality is that when Europeans make the decision, and then later Americans, to go to Africa and for hundreds of years kidnap millions of people against their will and bring them here with the intention of burning them alive and castrating them and killing them and treating them like chattel and doing all of this for the sole purpose of money, for the sole purpose of this slave system, this economic system. You can't do that if you can't justify it to yourself. You can't justify it to the world. You will not be able to do this if they are indeed human beings. They can't be mothers and fathers and sons and daughters. And so what we saw were Europeans creating justifications for this. They were uncivilized. They were unchristian. It was their duty by God. They were biologically inferior. And when you do all this, you create something that is subhuman. You create an other. You create something less than human. And then it's okay to treat them this way. And so that's how this racism was created, to justify the economic system that we were starting in this country. And that is how we've gone and continued through this, because we're not inherently racism, it's taught, right? And so when you keep asking that question of why would anybody teach somebody to be racism, this is where you will end up. And so if you look at this and how we treat people of color in our history, it's the same thing over and over again, right? When you can make somebody non-human, it makes it easier to commit violence against them. Look at immigration. When we make the jump and we now call undocumented immigrants, not mothers and fathers and sons and daughters, not human beings. When we make that jump and we now say that they are less than human, they are, quote, aliens, they're no longer human. And when you make that jump to saying they're aliens, they're anchor babies, all this racist talk, then it's easier to say put alligators in a moat by the fence or electrocute them all or use drones because they're not fully human. Look at the Middle East, right? What images do they show us about people in the Middle East? Do they show us mothers and fathers and sons and daughters, kids going to school and kissing their parents goodbye? No. They show us somebody in a hijab screaming Allah Akbar, the most bombastic image they can find, and they don't look like us or smell like us or talk like us or act like us, so therefore the translation is they're not truly one of us. So it's easier to say, turn the Middle East into a parking lot, use nuclear weapons on them. And we do this with the people in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. We, of course, will talk about what we do with the people in Japan during World War II and how it relates to nuclear weapons. Over and over again, we do the same thing. And this is the same thing when we look at Black Lives Matter and the police. The police, which are, of course, just an extension of the first slave patrol. And the police, if they are agents of the state and we are giving them a gun and we are saying they have the license to kill, but we know that the police are looking at African Americans as something less than human. Before the confrontation ever begins, those people are dead already. Darren Wilson, we're on the anniversary today of Michael Brown in Ferguson. Darren Wilson, the cop that murdered Michael Brown, when he was deposed, he said when Michael Brown came at him, he saw, quote, a demon. not a human being, not a person, not somebody's son. He saw a demon. So Michael Brown was dead before as soon as the altercation occurred. When Trayvon Martin was murdered, George Zimmerman said he saw a thug, not a human being. The cops that killed George Floyd, they didn't see somebody's son. They didn't see a human being. And so when you make this jump to somebody being less than human, it is easier to commit violence against them. And that, of course, is what we see with the people of Japan, right? During World War II, we had a genocidal race hatred towards the people of Japan that is unprecedented in this country's history. Worse than anything that even happened to people of Middle Eastern descent after 9/11. After Pearl Harbor, people of Japan were all deemed to be yellow vermin and monkeys and roaches. Because why? Make them less than human. It's easier to firebomb them. It's easier to put them in concentration camps and internment camps. It's easier to use nuclear weapons on them. And if you look at the history, we don't do this with Germans. We're very careful in our literature to separate Nazis from Germans, fascists from Italians, but not Japan. They were all guilty for what happened at Pearl Harbor. When after the atomic bombings happened, Gallup did a poll in which a week later, in which 85% of the American public wished that were happy with Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A Roper poll showed that 22% of the American public wished that Japan hadn't surrendered so we could have dropped more nuclear weapons and killed more people. And no poll up until late October 1945 ever showed more than 4.5% of the American public criticizing Truman's decision to do this. So overwhelmingly, the American people agreed with this. Not until of course, the remarkable work of John Hersey came out a year later did people's minds start to change. And so when I started this research of looking at the connections between African Americans and nuclear weapons, people, of course, said there would not be a reaction. That African Americans were too busy trying to gain their own freedom and equality. They didn't have time to worry about nuclear weapons. And of course, they were wrong. And the first story that I had found that kind of kickstarted this research for me was Malcolm X. In June of 1964, a group of Hiroshima survivors and peace activists were on a world peace study mission. And they were traveling around the world. And when they came to the United States, the woman that put their talk together was the great Japanese American activist Yuri Kachiyama, who's no longer with us. And she asked them, when you are here, what do you want to do most in the United States? And they all answered, meet Malcolm X. But Malcolm was visiting in the Middle East. He was visiting in Africa and traveling. And she wrote letters to him because they were friends and thinking he never got any of them. And then the last day that they were there, they were at a reception in her apartment in Harlem, and there was a knock at the door. When they opened the door, there stood Malcolm. And Malcolm said to those atomic bomb survivors, you've been hit with the atomic bomb, but the bomb that hit us was racism. And he spent the day talking with them about colonialism and Vietnam and civil rights, because Malcolm knew what so many before him knew, that the issue, how these things were connected, and that the issue wasn't civil rights, it was universal human rights. And so I look at those Black activists who consistently argued that nuclear disarmament, colonialism, and racism were inextricably linked. And so when you look at some of the first to come out against Truman's decision to use the bomb, whether it was in the Black press or the Black clergy, some of the bigger names, Langston Hughes, for example, was the first to come out publicly and question Truman's own racism in the decision to use nuclear weapons. He asked the question publicly, why did we not drop this on Germany or Italy? Why did we drop it on a people of color? And of course, Langston Hughes was right to do so. Harry Truman wasn't the most racist president in history. We probably have that now, but he was certainly one of the most racist presidents in U.S. history. If you go back and you look at Truman's diaries or his letters to his wife, Bess, he rarely ever refers to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. This is a man who, when he came back from World War I and was working in Missouri, he sent a $10 check to the Ku Klux Klan to become a member. They sent it back to him because he refused to fire Catholic workers in one of his businesses. He brags in interviews that when he and his family used to get slaves as wedding presents to start out the housekeeping with, his mother openly supported the Confederacy, and when she first visited him at the White House, said she'd rather sleep on the floor than ever step foot in Lincoln's bedroom. And when he is notified that the first atomic bomb has exploded and hundreds of thousands of people of color have been wiped off this planet, the first thing he does is jump up in the air and say, quote, this is the greatest thing in history. I found a letter by Zora Neale Hurston, somebody who was very apolitical in her career. She wrote to her friend Claude Barnett, in which she refers to Truman as the butcher of Asia, and is visibly upset that more in the Black community are not fighting back against nuclear weapons. And in that first initial protest, probably the most came from the Black Popular Front, notably the great W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, who is so largely forgotten in our history. Paul Robeson, speaking at Madison Square Garden a year later to 20,000 people, immediately asked the question, where is the uranium coming from to build our nuclear weapons? And the answer, of course, was the Belgian-controlled Congo. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was lionized in Asia already, said that what we did in Japan was going to set back the progress of colored nations for decades to come, and likened Truman to Hitler. And some of this affinity with the Black community in Japan was already built in before the bomb was ever dropped. When Japanese Americans were interned in this country, many in the Black community, and of course nothing's monolithic, but many in the Black community said, here's a group of people that didn't commit any crime, but were being put in these internment camps just for what they looked like and who they were. This could happen to us. And they started sneaking clothes and food to the people who were in these internment camps. They saw when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935 that it wasn't the United States, it was Japan that came out publicly and said they were going to come to the aid of their colored brothers and sisters in Ethiopia. So there was already an affinity built in. And so much of this initial criticism of Truman and the bomb goes silent in the late 1940s and early 50s when you had the Truman Doctrine. Long before George W. Bush ever said with us or against us, it was Truman who put that line in the sand. And if you weren't with Truman and you weren't with his nuclear policies, you were now on the side of the communists. The worst thing you could be called in this country was to be labeled black and red. You had HUAC and McCarthyism on the rise now. And so there were real consequences to be an anti-nuclear activist, especially if you were black. And some of these groups like the NAACP, they gamble and they make a sharp turn to the right. They ally themselves with Truman, thinking that this is going to result in civil rights, which of course it doesn't. But not everybody looked at nuclear disarmament as a bargaining chip. They saw that we were threatening to use nuclear weapons in Korea, again on a people of color. And so when the Stockholm Peace Pledge, the Ban the Bomb petition, was created out of communist bloc nations, people like Paul Robeson, Du Bois, and others, they took that and they brought it to the United States. And when I tell students about signing a petition now, it's nothing because they can go on their computers and go on change.org and they're one click away from being an activist. But back then, there were real consequences for signing a petition like that. People were physically beaten. They were put in jail. There were charges brought up on Du Bois as being an agent of a foreign agent of the Soviet Union, found not guilty, of course. And yet millions of people in this country, many from the Black community, signed this petition. People like Charlie Parker and Marianne Anderson, Duke Ellington, were all saying, enough, we're not going to allow another Hiroshima and Korea. And so as the 1950s progresses, look at just the year of 1955 and how these things are connected. In the summer of 1955, you have the heinous murder of Emmett Till. And a few months later in December, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus. But in the middle of that year, you also had what was known as the Bandung Conference, the first all-African Asian conference in Indonesia. And if you look at the platform of that conference, it was very explicit that they were against colonialism, white supremacy, and nuclear weapons. And many in this country, civil rights leaders, were sending their welcome wishes or going to visit and be part of this conference. And at the same time, in the late 1950s, you had Algeria rising up. You had Kwame Nkrumah and Ghana getting their independence in Africa. And the French decide they want to be a nuclear power. And they decide to test their first nuclear weapon where? In the Sahara, in Africa. And the people of Ghana worried that the fallout, the nuclear fallout, what it would do to their cocoa industry. And so one man saw all this happening and saw how these things were connected and decided to try to stop the French test, and that was Bayard Rustin. Rustin is, again, another amazing civil rights hero who is largely forgotten in our history because he was gay. So we iced him, we marginalized him out of the history, one of the best organizers we ever had. And so Rustin puts a team together of British activists and African activists and goes to Africa and literally puts his body on the line to try to stop this test until they can physically remove him and finally have their test. And protests break out all over the world over this. Kwame Nkrumah has more conferences, the World Without the Bomb Conference and others, to try to keep the focus on nuclear weapons. And not everybody agreed with this. People like A. Philip Randolph thought that Rustin should be here worrying about the primary of Kennedy and working on civil rights here. And Rustin was saying to civil rights leaders in the United States, don't you see how these things are all connected? This is the most important work I could be doing. And of course, if we're going to look at the civil rights movement, we need to look at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? People look at Dr. King's entrance into foreign policy really with his April 4th, 1967 speech at Riverside Church beyond Vietnam, a year to the day he died, when he famously calls the United States, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. But actually, if you look at nuclear weapons, you will see that he was speaking out 10 years before that, in 1957. That's when he made his first public comments against nuclear weapons and calling for nuclear abolition. And he continued this, talking about the triple evils of militarism and racism and capitalism and how these things are related. He would talk to black churches and to HBCUs and say it makes no sense to integrate lunch counters and then not worry about the world in which we're trying to integrate. And so where was King learning all of this stuff from? His wife, of course. Coretta Scott King was a long seasoned activist dating back to her days at Antioch College. She had been active with Women's Strike for Peace and the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. And like Coretta Scott King and so many other black women that were involved in this movement, they had to deal with racism inside these organizations that were dominated by white middle-class women. Women's Strike for Peace, in one conference in Detroit, the black members wanted to have signs that said desegregation or disintegration. And the white members said, absolutely not. We don't want race as part of this. And it was Coretta Scott King and others that had to broker the deal on that. You know, black women like Lorraine Hansberry, that we of course know from A Raisin in the Sun, but she was so much more than that. A feminist, a socialist, a radical. This was a woman who famously saw a film on Hiroshima and comes out of the movie theater and says, no more Hiroshimas, not now, not ever. Her last play was written about nuclear holocaust and what happens to the survivors. So there's this rich history of black women who have been at the forefront of this fight. And if you look through the 1960s, whether it's threatening to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam, if you look at the Black Panther Party, who formed in October of 1966, executive mandate number 1, when Bobby Seale reads that in Sacramento in front of the courthouse, the first statement they read, they explicitly compare the Black Freedom Movement and what they're going through to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I asked Bobby Seale, was this intentional? He said, of course it was. We always viewed ourselves in an international context, which is why Eldridge Cleaver and Kathleen and others went to Hiroshima and gave talks over there. And when you look at even the 1970s, you know, in the 1970s, there was, and maybe some of you were even part of it, it was called the Continental Walk for Nuclear Disarmament in the 1970s. And it was having people from all 4 corners of this country then gather in Washington, D.C. for nuclear disarmament. And for many, it was just in a way, a symbolic rally, but not for the black members, because they were coming from the southern leg. And if you were black, the police weren't protecting you, and they were physically beaten. If you were white and you allowed them to stay in your home, you were threatened. So there were real consequences there. You know, when we look at the 1970s and President Carter, he was going to try to push for his neutron bomb. One of the people that constantly tried to talk him out of it was his UN ambassador, Andy Young, right? Part of the civil rights movement. So again, we see this, we see the rise of, we see the leadership of black activists. And of course, this is all culminating in the 1980s, when Reagan comes in and blows through the military budget, slashes social spending for so many programs that help the poor. And so for many, especially those in the black community, they saw so many programs they needed being cut to build up more nuclear weapons. And you see the rise of Randall Forsberg and the nuclear freeze movement. All of this was coming together in the 1980s. But it was so much more than that. You know, when I was writing my book and writing articles and things, I got a call from a gentleman. He said, I know about your research and I got to talk to you. And I met with him, and he's in the book, him and his wife. His name was Greg Johnson. His wife was Linda. African-American man who was just a librarian at Georgetown. And he said, in the 1980s, we cared about this issue. We went to the white groups and we said, we want to be part of this. And they said, nah, the black community doesn't care. And so him and his wife, with a rotary phone and one flyer, started a group called Blacks Against Nukes by themselves. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And they got hundreds of members and grew in chapters and were featured in black periodicals and spoke in Hiroshima. You know, I'm so glad that we have the rise of the conscious athlete again, right? With LeBron James and so many, Colin Kaepernick, of course. So when we think of socially conscious athletes, our minds automatically go to Muhammad Ali, of course, and the '68 Olympics with Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising their fists in the air. But in the 1980s, there were other activists, athletes, called Athletes United for Peace. US and Russian athletes fighting for nuclear disarmament. The entire Baltimore Orioles baseball team went and visited Hiroshima at one point. You had people like JoJo White of the Boston Celtics, Marion Washington, the first black track and field Olympian, all coming out and cutting PSAs and working for nuclear disarmament. And the height of the 1980s came with, of course, the June 12, 1982 rally in Central Park, in which 1 million people gathered calling for nuclear disarmament. And even that, you had 50% of the leadership that day were African-American, led by the great Reverend Herbert Daughtry and the Black United Front. You know, people like Rita Marley and Shaka Khan, Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee, and so many that were speaking out against nuclear weapons, thousands pouring in from Bed-Stuy and from Harlem. So many people of color fighting on this front that we forget. And, you know, doing this research and especially writing this book, the hardest part for me was talking about President Obama at the time. He was still president at the time, and I knew I was going to have to deal with this. And as a historian, the worst thing you want to do is write about something and predict something and be wrong, right? It's there forever. And so President Obama, of course, as a college student, wrote about nuclear disarmament, and as a senator spoke about it, and of course as a candidate. And when he became president, of course, in April of 2009, he gave the Prague speech, which is arguably the most anti-nuclear speech any president has ever given, with possibly the exception of President John F. Kennedy's commencement address at American University in June of 1966, known as the peace speech. And after that, President Obama put together the Nuclear Security Summit, which was to try to get loose nuclear weapons making materials in safe hands. And that was important because he got enough materials out of the Ukraine to make 4 nuclear weapons just months before it went into chaos. He then signed the New START Treaty with Russia. And the thing that I think was most important of his entire presidency is, without firing a single shot, got Iran to stop building a nuclear weapons program. And at least symbolically, I had pushed for this for so long and had nothing to do with it, but was so happy to see our first sitting president visit Hiroshima as president. Now, does that mean President Obama was perfect? Of course not. President Obama is still signed on to the modernization plan of trillions of dollars. I would have liked him to take nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert and call for no first use. But I don't blame that on Obama. I blame that on us, because he never said, yes, I can. He said, yes, we can. And if we would have had millions in the streets demanding this, then perhaps it would have happened. And the other important thing to understand is Obama was not the first politician who was African-American to fight on this front. People forget about those like Jesse Jackson, who ran for president in 1984 and in 1988. And his platform was far more anti-nuclear than any Democrat running for office in those primaries. People like Ron Dellums out of California. Ron Dellums, who was a giant in the Congressional Black Caucus and led this fight to stop the MX missile from Reagan trying to build the MX missile. In fact, at one point he goes to Utah to meet with Spencer Kimball, the head of the Mormon Church, to try to get him to come out against building it there. You had people like Harold Washington, the first black mayor of Chicago, was one of Obama's heroes, who won awards for his anti-nuclear efforts. And so now what? Well, as somebody who has fought so many years to eliminate racism and nuclear weapons in this country and indeed in the world, and then to see where we are with nuclear weapons, to see where we are with who's the president and what has happened over these last couple of years, especially with so much overt racism, it is easy for me to feel defeated. But I made a promise to Hibaksha long ago that I would never stop fighting on this front. Right now, Trump can launch nuclear weapons without the authority of anybody by himself. It would take 32 nuclear warheads to completely decimate North Korea, 90 to take out Iran, 147 to take out Russia. He has got the coveted Ku Klux Klan endorsement. He's called for Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, and so many other nations to build their own nuclear weapons. He wants to resume nuclear testing, and we know what that has done to people of color throughout the world. His plans for military spending, reporters have said, is Reaganomics on steroids. And so for me, when I'm looking at the juxtaposition and how race and nuclear weapons are related, when I see that you have 122 nations who have signed on for the nuclear weapons ban treaty, right? Mostly nations that are dominated by a people of color. And on the other side, you have Putin and Trump, two white supremacist authoritarian leaders with 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal. To me, it cannot be any clearer what we are looking at. And so when I work with Black Lives Matter activists now and my students now, they're having real conversations about monuments and about what the history is and learning from their leaders. They study and learn from Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and CORE and the Panthers, the Deacons for Defense, the NAACP. They learn from these leaders. And our younger generation needs to learn from the leaders of this movement and the people that came before us. The reality is nuclear weapons and racism may be with us when we're all gone. But we have to start thinking beyond our generation, right? We have to think about our kids and our grandkids and these generations. And so that's what's prompted me to want to start studying and writing this new book I'm working on the June 12th rally. I wanted to see what they did. How did they put 1 million people in the streets? How did they galvanize so many people in the 1980s? And when you study that time period, that movement, you realize that this idea that the anti-nuclear movement has only been dominated by white middle-class males is a myth. Whether it's African Americans that I've looked at so far, or if you look at the June 12th rally, that was organized by women, by members of the LGBTQ community, by people of color. They were all there. They were all leading and organizing this movement, right? And so, I'm hoping that years from now, I'll be giving a talk like this, hopefully in person, and I'll be saying there was a time when we had nuclear weapons and institutional racism, we managed to abolish them both. People say when I say that I'm nuts and naive. Maybe I am. But I look at South Africa, and South Africa was able to dismantle apartheid. They're not perfect, but they dismantled it. And they also dismantled their nuclear weapons program. So I fail to believe that. I won't believe that it can't be done. We have lost some giants recently. Bruce Blair, who founded Global Zero, taught me so much. We, of course, lost C.T. Vivian, Joseph Lowery, and the great John Lewis. John Lewis was a co-sponsor with Eleanor Holmes Norton on a bill to get rid of nuclear weapons. And these were people that walked the walk. These were people that so many of our younger folks look up to and learn from. The average age of the Hiroshima, the atomic bomb survivors, is over 80. Many of them are dying. Many of the ones that I've known over the years are gone. They worry, they're scared who's going to carry on their legacy, who's going to carry on their story of no more Hiroshimas and pick up that banner. 2022, 2 years from now, will be the 40th anniversary of the June 12, 1982 rally in Central Park. All this week and again tonight, I am calling on all of us, concerned citizens, anti-nuclear groups, arms control groups, peace groups, to start now, to pledge that we are going to get together. We are going to organize like we've never organized before. And then in 2 years from now, on June 12th, 2022, we are going to put 1 million people back in Central Park to finally get this nuclear ban treaty moving in this country, to finally get a new freeze movement going if we need to, and Markey has called for it, and to really get this movement back to where it needs to be. Dr. King often said the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But I would argue, not unless all of us here tonight bend it ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vinny. That was a wonderful talk. Max, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, obviously you got to thank Vinny for first of all doing the work and then sharing with so many. And I've noticed that Vinny's been on other of these Zoom conferences, so he's really spreading the word. I want to jump on some of the things he said, and I really want to invoke like a strategy session to take off on what he said and a couple of things I'm going to say. I don't think there's any chance in the near future that our government is going to ratify the United Nations treaty, but we got to work, as Benny is saying, we got to work on this issue, and this is, to me, critical. When I got to Baltimore, I worked with Nuclear Free America, and our newsletter was called The New Abolitionist. This caused me to do some reading on the movement to abolish slavery. One of my favorite abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison, who was the editor of The Liberator. If you go down to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., you can see the first issue of that great magazine. For writing an article about a ship captain who unloaded slaves in the Baltimore harbor, he served 40 days in the Baltimore City Jail. Obviously, Frederick Douglass also spent time in Baltimore. One of the great British abolitionists was the Quaker Thomas Clarkson. If you want to read a fabulous book and a fabulous chapter in Adam Hawkshaw's book, Bury the Chains, there's a meeting where Douglass and Garrison go to London to meet Thomas Clarkson just before he dies. When I worked for NFA, Tacoma Park became a nuclear-free zone and is still today a nuclear-free zone. Also, many people might have forgotten this or they didn't even realize this, but Helen Clark, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, made New Zealand a nuclear-free zone. And you can imagine the consternation that came out of the USA and Australia. Before coming to Baltimore, I worked on a campaign in Erie, PA, where we passed a ballot initiative to show support for the nuclear freeze. Also, we took 2 buses to this historic march that Vinny's telling us about, June 12th, 1982. And as he said, it's probably the biggest march in our history. I don't have to tell you, Reagan was in office, Euro missiles were there, but it was quite a time, but it was also a fabulous movement. And I urge everybody to see the documentary In Our Hands about June 12th, 1982. It is incredible. Being on the outside, you don't know really what's going on in the inside. And these are just some of the people that participated. Vinny he mentioned Coretta Scott King earlier, but she was one of the speakers on the stage in Central Park. Also, obviously, Helen Caldecott, Pete Seeger was there, Meryl Streep was there. He said Rita Marley, and obviously we got to remember Randy Forsberg, who created this nuclear freeze movement and died well before her time. And it's already been mentioned that ICANN won the Peace Prize in 2017. We now have 40, I just learned this today, we now have 44 countries that have ratified the treaty ban. We need 6 more. But, and also today I heard the mayor of Nagasaki asked Abe to have Japan, you would think Japan would have been the first country before the Vatican to ratify, and Abe said, no way possible. I don't see how we can discuss nuclear abolition unless we change the hearts and minds of our legislators. In Maryland, through Prevent Nuclear War Maryland and Peace Action Maryland, we have established relationships with all of our federal legislators and have had numerous meetings in DC, Baltimore, and more frequently now in Zoom conferences. I am advocating a Zoom webinar to promote this idea in other states, what we're doing in Maryland. Let's see if we can replicate it elsewhere. Going back to the Iraq War, there wasn't the same 2 groups, but there are other groups working on this. We managed to get our 2 senators and 4 of our 8 members of Congress in Maryland to vote against the Iraq War. More recently, we worked very, very hard on trying to get our legislators to support a 10% cut in the military budget. And again, we got 2 senators. This time we got 3 of our legislators. And when we do this, we use the term, we are citizen activists. And by that, we're out in the streets, just like Black Lives Matter. I was just at a Black Lives Matter demonstration yesterday. We're also inside where we're lobbying and we're trying to force our legislators to do the right thing. I look forward to a vigorous discussion on strategies for abolishing nuclear weapons. I do not know how we can achieve this goal without getting the legislators to join the mission. And thank you for being on this webinar and allowing me a few words today.
Okay, thank you, Max. So now I'm going to read a few questions. So if you have a question, either for Professor Intondi or for Max, if you could just type it in the chat. So one question. This is for you, Vinny. The question is, does Professor Intondi see white groups becoming more aware of the necessity of solidarity of groups and races in abolishing nuclear weapons?
Okay. Do I see white groups? Say that again. Do I see white groups? Go ahead.
Becoming more aware of the necessity of solidarity, I guess, among everyone in abolishing nuclear weapons.
So yes, in terms of the nuclear disarmament groups that are already out there, right? So groups like Global Zero, groups like Beyond the Bomb, ICANN, all these kind of groups, we're seeing a huge outpouring of content and activism, recognizing the connections, whether it's with nuclear testing, whether it's the Marshall Islands, whether it is atomic veterans, whether it is the Savannah River Project, the history there, even things like, you know, to kind of double back with Max, is with legislature is economic conversion, right? Is going to people in Baltimore, especially to parents, to get them involved and saying, look, it wasn't too long ago where they were asking you to bring in space heaters for your kids because there wasn't heat in the public schools. And we're going to spend $1 trillion on nuclear weapons. Maybe you need to start contacting, you know, your legislature on this. So, so in that realm, yes. In the larger sense of just white activists for every cause out there, I mean, I think the big thing is just getting them engaged in a general sense on the nuclear issue. And I think tying it to race is one way to get them involved, since there is such a concern right now in terms, especially of Black Lives Matter.
Okay, here's another question, Vinny. How do you see what has been Susan Rice's approach to nuclear weapons? And how might this be an issue if she's nominated to be vice president?
Susan Rice has towed the line just like every other Democrat, really. I mean, she's not somebody that, again, I don't think whether it's Biden, whether it's Susan Rice, whether it's any of these people, they're going to just come in and they're going to, you know, be like, all right, we're going to sign the treaty and we're going to do this, you know. But what I do think that we can do is, if it's one of them, if it is Biden, whoever he picks, I think we have the ability to at least push them and work with them, like Max is saying, to get them at least to sign the New START treaty. At least you can get your foot in the door to talk about maybe thinking about no first use. You can get them to maybe talk about, you know, not expanding our arsenal. So there are things like that. As far as the treaty goes, no, I'm not naive to think that we're just going to, no matter who's in there, even if it was Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, that somebody's just going to sign the treaty and we're going to eliminate nuclear weapons. No. But what I do think is it will have the same effect as we had with landmines. It will have the same effect as we had with chemical weapons. That over time, we stigmatize those types of weapons so much that the world recognizes that they are obsolete, that we should not be using them, they're abhorrent. And you will continuously do that through the ban treaty. So, so whether it's Susan Rice or whether it was, you know, the bats, whoever it is, none of them is going. I'm going to be like, okay, great, we're on the path now. But again, is it better? To me, the question always becomes, president or vice president. The main question for me going into the voting booth is always, if we are faced with another Cuban Missile Crisis, who do I want sitting in Kennedy's seat? I don't think any one person should have the ability to end the world, no matter who it is. But if I had to pick right now, I'd much rather have Joe Biden sitting in that seat than Donald Trump, right? Or if, you know, whoever his vice president is. And that to me is always the guiding principle. So that's what I would say on that one.
Okay, Vinny, here's a comment. It's worth noting that the late Jerome Frank, a psychiatrist and a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility, wrote about the image of the enemy as a psychological tool used to justify treating enemies like the Japanese as less than human. I don't know if you want to say any more about that or not.
No, yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you probably one of the better books to read on that is John Dower's War Without Mercy. And you'll just see this kind of thing over and over again. But again, I think, you know, when people study Japan or they study Vietnam or they see these kind of this imagery, then it's important to bring it all the way back and say, when we're looking at institutional racism, this has actually started from the very beginning, right? This starts all the way back with slavery. This starts when we look at, if you go all the way back where racism began. So even when I start my African American history classes this semester and on slavery, the first question I'll ask students is, are we racist, and our racism caused slavery, or did slavery cause us to become racist? And it really makes them think. And when they realize we're not inherently racist, right? We're not born racist. And the next question becomes, why would anybody learn racism? Why would anybody teach somebody else racism? And you just keep peeling that back, and then they of course understand that it was for our economic system. But this kind of imagery of creating something that's less than human, we have done since the very beginning to people of color, and Japan, of course, is no different, and he highlights that.
Okay, here's another question for you, Vinny. The world was on the edge of their seats when Trump was involved in brinkmanship with North Korea and then later Iran. But my sense is that Trump stepped back at the last moment from starting wars. Am I correct that leaders like Trump that claim not to be afraid to threaten the use of force really do understand the potential consequences, or were we just lucky?
We were lucky. We've been lucky so many times. I mean, if anybody will tell us it's luck, I mean, look at Bob McNamara, look at Daniel Ellsberg, they echo the same thing. It is between nuclear accidents, between a chance that a Russian on a submarine doesn't think that sonar is a nuclear weapon, that there's so many times we've been lucky, and this is no different. I mean, Trump and Kim Jong-un are irrational individuals, irrational. And they have the ability to end the world. I don't think Trump has repeatedly said, why can't we just use them? He has actually said we should use them to stop hurricanes. I mean, there's no question in my mind that if he thought it would help him win an election, he would do this. I mean, now Saudi Arabia, we see recently talking about, will they start building a bomb with their nuclear weapons program? And we see that they would do it to try to, quote, keep Iran at bay. We had Iran at bay. It was done under Obama, right? That's gone now. So if he's tearing up every single agreement that we have, it is absolutely, and I think now is the time to capitalize, because like with Reagan, his rhetoric and what was going on, when I interviewed so many people why they got involved in the June 12th rally, the response was from so many, even the organizers, they said, in some ways, we didn't need to recruit. So many people were coming to us because they were so genuinely scared that we were going to have nuclear war with Russia. Whether it was from films that were being made, whether it was the books that were coming out, or just Reagan's own and his whole entire administration's rhetoric. This is the same thing now, that when people really stop and think that Trump, this person who is just unfit in every way, right, is in control. There's nothing can stop him. Like we've seen even debates on news channels and things of, what at the last second, if he wanted to launch, would some military officer tackle him and get the nuclear football out of his? No, they would not. There is no checks and balances. And so, no, I think it is pure luck that we are not dead right now from nuclear war. But, we absolutely have to act on this.
Okay, here's a good question. How do you imagine our legislators responding to nuclear disarmament discussions while many are accepting donations through political PACs of defense contractors?
Yeah, that's a huge issue, right? And I think you tackle that from a couple different ways too, because so what I find even more difficult than just getting the PAC money is, I gave a talk when I was doing the book tour for the first book. I gave a talk in Syracuse, New York, and the people there, more than one in the crowd would say, look, I'm with you. I'm not in favor of nuclear weapons, but the main employer in our city is Lockheed Martin. That's it. So for me, it's a job. I don't think about it ideologically. It's a paycheck. It's kind of like coal miners in West Virginia when you're like, hey, I'm not really in favor of this, but find me another job. I don't know how to do anything with solar, et cetera, right? It's the same thing. So for the Congress people then that represent that district in central New York, they're going to fight tooth and nail to keep nuclear weapon production going, because those are their constituents and that's who's voting for them. So I think that's another piece of this that we have to look at when we're trying to address how do we get legislators involved in this, right? And then, of course, like, again, convincing people that it's in their political interest. Like, this should not be a hard lift. But, you know, again, in the 80s, you saw how many thought it was okay, this was something we should be doing with nuclear freeze. And I think with the Congressional Black Caucus, that's a good place to start to say, look at, for a lot of years, the CBC was at the forefront of this. It's time to get that back. Can't just be Barbara Lee doing all the lifting here. We need more, you know, to get involved in this.
Gene, could I say something?
Sure.
One member of Prevent Nuclear War Maryland is involved in Move the Money. And that's the idea, to do just what Vinny's talking about. So that's an active group. And I encourage anybody in Maryland to get involved in that group. My representative is John Sarbanes. He will not take big money. And that's something we congratulate him for. And I think that's very important strategy if you're talking to your legislators, besides beating them up for voting for the Iraq War or whatever your issue is. We have to thank them when they do the right thing. And after the vote on the 10% cut, that's exactly what we did. We contacted the 5 people to say thank you, but we also contacted the other legislators, say you did the wrong thing. Judge Ruppersberger, for example, got the "you're a bad boy," and that's a guy that gets a lot of money from Lockheed Martin.
Yeah, I think, you know, we have to be very clear, and then I'm sorry, and then Gwen, I'll hop in here, but we have to be very clear, like you said, of sitting there and saying, look, I will be your foot soldier. We will campaign for you. I will knock on doors for you. I'll register voters for you if you are going to be on our side on this issue. And if not, we're going to run against you, right? Global Zero did a great thing during the last 2 elections ago, where they just bird-dogged candidates. They just found them in every press line they could, every rope line, had them on camera. Where do you stand on no first use? Where do you stand on nuclear weapons? And then blasted that on social media and just held their feet to the fire over and over again. Pushed to get these questions into debates. Like, yeah, those things all matter. So yeah, I agree on that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Gwen.
Let me say something first, Gwen. Max, there's a question. You had mentioned in your talk about some of the Maryland legislators who voted with us on the 10% cut, and somebody wanted to know who they were. You want to just name them off?
Well, you know them as well as I do, but both senators, so we know who. I assume everybody knows who they are. And then we got the ever faithful Raskin, Sarbanes, and I think we were surprised by Trone.
Infumi.
Who is just stepped into the office. And we, just to share this with you, as I told you, we're having these meetings. We are meeting the legislators and we're meeting their staff, and we're developing this relationship. Many people simply have to go online and send in a message. We don't have to do that. We go right to the legislator, which works on this particular issue. And we had a meeting even before Mfume got the seat in Baltimore. We met with a person who was possibly going to be on his staff to discuss this issue. So I was thrilled to see that. And just to share this, because this is very important in my opinion, we got Baltimore City Council to pass divestment legislation from South Africa, and the legislator at that time on the Baltimore City Council was Kweisi Mfume. So I give him great kudos for his present vote and what happened in the mid 80s in Baltimore City.
Okay, Gwen, do you want to say something before we start to close?
Yeah, okay, well, it's the issue about money, and I think this is where the UN Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons comes in. And yes, we are in a nation, and all the NATO nations are not going to vote for the UN treaty, but we're now at 44, thanks to St. Kitts and, is it Nevis?
Nevis.
That was the 44th nation. And so we're close to 50. And when this passes, then Johns Hopkins, which has a huge contract, we don't know how much of it is nuclear, but it's large, and Lockheed Martin, which is one of the 4 major nuclear contractors in the world and the biggest military contractor in the world. But back to nuclear, these institutions, these corporations will then be working in prohibited nuclear weapons complex commerce. I mean, what they will be doing is it will be prohibited by international UN law, and I think it will make it easier for us to shame them And will that be enough to overcome the profits they are making? Well, I guess we'll just have to do a lot of shaming.
Okay, Vinny, we're just about ready to close. I have a very few last minute points, but do you want to say some last words?
No, just again, thank you. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. So let me see if I can. So I wanted to share some resources with you. One is Back from the Brink, which is a national campaign to enact 5 policies in the U.S. that would lessen the risk of nuclear war. So if you just go to preventnuclearwar.org, there are a lot of resources there, a lot of information. And I would like to say that Montgomery County and also Baltimore City have passed resolutions in support of Back from the Brink. And we're working on trying to get other counties and cities in Maryland to do the same thing. ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, that's the organization that won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago and is working very hard in a variety of ways to abolish nuclear weapons, and they were the main instigators of getting the UN declaration passed. We've mentioned a couple of times Prevent Nuclear War Maryland. We have conference calls every 2 weeks, and it's throughout Maryland, and we're trying to do a number of things, and we encourage you to go to our website, preventnuclearwarmaryland.org, and let us know if you want to be involved in that. Maryland Peace Action is also working on nuclear weapons, and the website is Peace Action MD for Maryland, peaceactionmd.org, and you can find a lot of resources there and also a way to get involved. We also have, Maryland Peace Action also has a Facebook page that actually is really excellent right now due to the work of the very energetic Russ Passon. So please go to our Facebook page, like it, share it, and so forth. And then finally, if anyone on this conference call, on this Zoom call, has a question, or if you want to get involved, you can send me an email. My email address is jlathethy@comcast.net. So these are some really good places for you to start to find out more information